The fluorescent lights in courtroom 14B hummed with a sterile, predatory vibration. My parents sat behind their mahogany table, looking like statues carved from ice and old money. She never served. She stole our name. She made it all up, my mother hissed in court. I didn't flinch. I just looked at the judge. She stood up slowly and took off her robe. The black silk pooled on her chair like a shadow. Beneath the fabric, she wore a simple, olive, drab tactical shirt. The air in the room turned brittle as the court reporter stopped typing. My father adjusted his gold watch, his knuckles white against the metal. He expected a quick ruling, a clean erasure of my existence. Instead, Judge Morales walked around the bench with a deliberate, measured stride. Every movement she made suggested a history of mud and iron rather than law books. She stopped 3 feet from me. Her eyes were dark and searching. She didn't look at my parents. She looked at my throat. I kept my hands folded on the defense table to hide the tremor. My mother's lawyer began to protest, citing procedural decorum and judicial bias. Morales ignored him entirely. She reached up and unbuttoned her collar, pulling the fabric aside to reveal a jagged, silver scar. It ran from her collarbone down into the hidden depths of her shirt. I felt the phantom weight of a field dressing in my palms. The memory of copper, scented blood flooded my senses. My mother's triumphant smirk finally began to flicker and die. "Counsel, sit down," Morales said, her voice dropping into a low, hardened register. The room fell into a suffocating silence. My father leaned forward, his face reddening with a mixture of confusion and growing panic. He had spent months paying people to scrub my records from every digital database. He thought he had burned every bridge I ever crossed. He never considered that some bridges were made of bone and shared trauma. Morales looked at him with a cold, terrifying recognition. The legal trap was beginning to snap shut. The judge turned back to me and whispered a single string of numbers. They were the GPS coordinates for a dusty landing zone outside of Kandahar. My throat tightened as I whispered the response, my old call sign. It felt like swallowing a hot coal. A Pentagon liaison stepped through the back doors, carrying a briefcase chained to his wrist. My parents' attorney dropped his pen, the plastic clattering loudly against the floor. The immaculate narrative of my fraud was shattering. The judge wasn't a stranger. She was my witness. The liaison opened the case and pulled out a single, red, stamped folder. These were the files that didn't exist in the civilian world. Morales took the documents and placed them directly in front of my mother. Diane's pearls rattled as she began to shake. She stared at the medevac form and the signature at the bottom. It was a record of the life I had saved, while they were telling neighbors I was away at school. The gavel fell once, a sharp sound like a rifle shot. My name was finally mine again. The gavel's echo died against the courtroom's marble walls. My mother gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white and skeletal. "This is a mistake," she whispered, her voice cracking for the first time. The judge didn't look away from her. Morales stood tall, her tactical shirt a sharp contrast to the legal finery around us. She was no longer a neutral arbiter. She was a ghost returning to the world of the living. My father stood up, trying to regain his practiced composure. He smoothed his silk tie and looked at the Pentagon liaison with a forced, condescending smile. "Records can be falsified, especially in high-stress zones," he stated firmly. The lawyer beside him nodded, preparing a fresh motion. They were still trying to bury the truth under a mountain of paperwork. I watched them, feeling a cold detachment. They didn't realize that some wounds were far deeper than ink. The judge leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied my father's face. "The files are authenticated by a digital signature you cannot replicate," she said. Her voice was like grinding stones. She reached into her folder and pulled out a faded, stained map of Kandahar. It was the original coordinate sheet from the night of the ambush. She slid it across the bench. My mother reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the dried, brown stains. I signed those orders myself. Morales continued, her tone dropping an octave. The courtroom felt smaller, the air thick with the smell of ozone and old metal. My mother looked at me, her eyes filled with a sudden, sharp terror. She finally realized that the erasure hadn't worked. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the bailiff seemed to hold his breath. I saw the exact moment her perfect, carefully constructed world began to tilt. A knock at the heavy oak doors broke the tension. A second man in a dark suit entered, carrying a locked silver canister. He walked straight to the judge, ignoring the lawyers and the gallery. My father's jaw tightened as he recognized the insignia on the man's lapel. It was the mark of the Internal Affairs Division from his own firm. The pressure in the room shifted instantly. A new secret was about to be dragged into the light. The man handed a single flash drive to Morales. We found the original service records in the plaintiff's private vault, he announced. My father slumped into his chair, the color draining from his face. They hadn't just denied my service. They had stolen the physical proof and hidden it in a basement. The betrayal felt like a fresh physical blow. I looked at the judge. She wasn't surprised. She had anticipated their next desperate move. Morales plugged the drive into her computer and hit a key. A video feed flickered to life on the gallery screens. It was grainy, thermal footage from a helmet camera. I saw myself, younger and covered in grit, pulling a soldier from a burning vehicle. The soldier was Morales. My mother let out a small, choked sob and covered her mouth. As the video played, a second figure appeared in the background. It was my father. The thermal footage bloomed in shades of eerie green and white. My father looked younger on screen, standing near a black SUV at the edge of the airfield. He wasn't a worried parent. He was a contractor finalizing a deal. I watched him trade a thick envelope for a set of hard drives. The camera panted with my own jagged breath as I dragged Morales toward safety. He never looked at me. He just checked his watch. The courtroom fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. My mother stared at the screen, her mouth hanging open in a silent scream. She looked at my father, as if he were a stranger she had just met. He didn't blink. He just stared at the grain of the wood on the table. He had known I was there. He had seen the fire and heard the screams. Yet, he chose the profit over the blood of his daughter. You were the logistics lead for the extraction, Judge Morales said. Her voice was cold enough to freeze the blood in the room. She looked at the timestamp on the video. It matched the exact minute she had almost died in the sand. My father's lawyer tried to stand, but Morales waved him down with a sharp, final gesture. There were no motions left to file. The evidence was a physical weight they couldn't lift or move. I stepped forward, my boots clicking rhythmically against the floor. My objective was simple now. I wanted him to say my name. I wanted him to acknowledge the daughter he had sold for a government contract. Look at me, Graham, I said. My voice was steady. A weapon forged in the same fire that had scarred the judge. He finally lifted his head. His eyes were void of regret. They held only the calculated coldness of a businessman. It was a matter of national security, he replied. His tone was dismissive, as if he were explaining a bad investment. My mother let out a sharp, hysterical laugh that echoed off the high ceiling. She realized then that her perfect life was a facade built on my disappearance. He had told her I was dead to claim a massive insurance payout. He had used my service as a tax write-off. The cruelty was surgical and deep. Judge Morales leaned over the bench, her expression unreadable. She looked at the bailiff and nodded toward the back of the room. The records show a second payment, she noted. She scrolled through the data on the flash drive. Her brow furrowed as she reached the bottom of the ledger. It wasn't just a contract for extraction. It was a bounty. Someone had paid to ensure the survivors of that crash never made it home alive. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My father hadn't just watched me from the sidelines. He had been the one who cleared the airstrike on our position. The static on the thermal feed suddenly cleared, revealing a radio in his hand. He was speaking into it, his lips moving in a steady rhythm. Outside, a siren began to wail. The doors to the courtroom slammed shut and locked from the outside. The heavy deadbolts clicked into place with a hollow, metallic thud. I stared at the locked doors, then back at the man who shared my DNA. The sirens outside grew louder, a chorus of rising panic in the humid air. My father remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the flickering screen. He didn't look like a man cornered. He looked like a man waiting for a signal. The judge gripped her gavel, her knuckles turning bone white. "You called for the strike," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. The room felt vacuum, sealed, stripping away the oxygen. My mother collapsed into her chair, her immaculate facade finally shattering into jagged pieces. She looked at the radio in the footage, then at her husband's calm profile. The betrayal was total. It was a calculated liquidation of a human asset. My own father had appraised my life and found it worth less than a contract. Morale stood up, her gaze sweeping the room for threats. She reached under the bench and pulled a service pistol from a concealed holster. "This isn't a standard police response," she noted, her voice sharp and focused. The lights flickered once, then died, plunging the courtroom into a terrifying, murky gray. Emergency red strobes began to pulse, casting long, bloody shadows against the marble walls. The digital feed on the gallery screens turned into static. I moved toward the bench, my instincts taking over the silence. My objective was to secure the flash drive before the data vanished. My father finally stood, his silhouette towering in the rhythmic red light. "The signal is jammed, Graham." Morales shouted over the sirens. He didn't respond. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, black detonator. The power balance in the room shifted from legal battle to a siege. "Don't do this," I said, my voice cutting through the noise. I could see the sweat beading on his forehead in the strobe light. He wasn't a soldier, but he was a man who understood leverage. He held the device high, his thumb hovering over the red button. My mother reached out for him, but he pushed her aside with a cold indifference. He wasn't going to prison. He was going to burn the evidence. The judge stepped down from the bench, her weapon leveled at his chest. "Drop it, or I will end this here," she commanded. The tension was a physical weight, pressing against my lungs. My father smiled, a thin and bloodless expression. "The building is already rigged," he replied softly. He looked at me then, and for a second, I saw a flicker of something human. Then his thumb pressed down. Nothing happened. The detonator was dead. I held up the internal battery I had swiped during the darkness. My hands were steady, a skill I had learned in the dust of Kandahar. I had seen him reaching for it when the lights first died. The silence that followed was heavier than the sirens. My father's face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He lunged across the table toward me. Behind him, the locked doors began to buckle under a heavy, rhythmic battering. My father's lunge was clumsy, fueled by a desperate, terminal fury. I stepped aside, letting his momentum carry him into the heavy defense table. The mahogany groaned under the impact as his water bottle shattered. He gasped for air, his face purple in the strobing red emergency light. I gripped the stolen battery tightly, my pulse a rhythmic drum in my ears. He tried to scramble up, but Judge Morales was already there. She pressed the muzzle of her weapon against his temple. The battering at the doors intensified, shaking the very frame of the courtroom. Dust drifted from the ceiling like gray snow, coating the evidence folders. "Stay down, Graham," the judge warned, her voice a low and dangerous vibration. My mother remained frozen in her chair, her eyes fixed on the empty detonator. She looked at her husband as if the man she knew had vanished. The man left behind was a hollow shell of greed. A heavy boom signaled the hinges were finally failing. I turned toward the back of the room, expecting a tactical team to breach. Instead, a familiar high-pitched whistle cut through the sirens. It was a signal I had heard 1,000 times in the valleys of Kandahar. My breath hitched as the doors finally buckled inward. A group of men in civilian clothes rushed through the dust. They weren't police or government agents. They were veterans I recognized from the base. They moved with the silent, lethal grace of a hunting pack. The lead man stopped and signaled for the others to fan out. He wore a worn field jacket and carried a heavy breaching tool. His eyes met mine, and he gave a short, sharp nod of recognition. "We heard the transmission, DR," he said. His voice gravelly and calm. My father's lawyer tried to scramble toward the exit, but they blocked his path. They weren't here to save my father. They were here for the man who betrayed their unit. The power balance in the room collapsed into something primal and raw. My father looked at the men, his eyes widening as he recognized their faces. These were the survivors he had tried to liquidate years ago. They had lived through his airstrike and waited for this exact moment. Judge Morales didn't lower her weapon, but her posture shifted slightly. She knew these men better than she knew the law. The courtroom had become a battlefield. My father finally started to tremble. "The drive has everything," I said, holding the flash drive up for them to see. The lead veteran reached out, his hand scarred and steady. He took the drive with a reverence that made my throat tighten. This was their proof, their justice, and their stolen history. My mother stood up slowly, her hand reaching for my father's arm. He shoved her away again, his focus entirely on the men. He knew his money couldn't buy his way out of this room. The veterans moved in a coordinated circle, closing the distance to my father. One of them pulled a set of zip ties from his pocket. "The police are 2 minutes out," Morales stated, checking her watch. She looked at me, then at the men who had been my only real family. A new complication arose as the lead man looked at the judge. He didn't want a trial or a prison cell for Graham. He wanted the coordinates to the site. He wanted revenge. The lead veteran, a man named Elias, stepped closer to my father. He ignored the judge's weapon and the pulsing red light. His focus was entirely on the man who had traded our lives for a budget increase. Hey. The air in the room grew heavy with the scent of ozone and unvented rage. My objective was to prevent a summary execution in the middle of a federal courtroom. I stepped between Elias and my father, my hands open and visible. I knew that one wrong move would trigger a bloodbath. Elias stopped, his eyes like flint. "He doesn't get the comfort of a cage, Gemma," he growled. The men behind him shifted, their movements echoing the tactical drills we had mastered in the desert. My father retreated until his back hit the cold marble wall. He looked small now, stripped of his expensive suits and legal shields. The power he had wielded was a paper tiger in the face of these hardened survivors. The judge kept her gun leveled, but her hand was beginning to tremble with suppressed emotion. "The drive contains the coordinates for offshore accounts," I said, my voice cutting through the tension. I needed them to realize that the money was the only thing that could truly destroy him. If they killed him now, the assets would vanish into a legal vacuum. Elias hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the flash drive in his hand. The greed that had fueled my father's betrayal was also the key to his permanent ruin. My mother watched us with a hollow, vacant expression. She was already mentally gone. The sirens outside reached a deafening peak as the first tactical team reached the hallway. We could hear the rhythmic thud of heavy boots and the sharp bark of commands. The veterans didn't flinch. They had faced far worse than local police in their time. My father saw a flicker of hope in the approaching authorities. He thought the law would protect him from the consequences of his actions. He was wrong. The judge turned her head toward the door, her expression hardening into something final and absolute. Lock the secondary latch. Morales commanded the bailiff. She wasn't ready to let the outside world in just yet. There was a protocol for situations involving classified military assets that the police didn't understand. She looked at me and nodded toward the evidence locker. I realized she was giving me a window to secure the physical files before they were seized. My father tried to speak, but Elias placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. The physical contact seemed to deflate whatever remained of his arrogance. I moved toward the locker, my fingers dancing over the keypad. The metal felt ice, cold against my skin. Inside, I found the original medals and the field gloves I thought were lost forever. These were the items my father had stolen to make me a ghost. I tucked them into my jacket, feeling the weight of my reclaimed history. A sudden crash sounded from the ceiling as a vent cover fell to the floor. A thick, white smoke began to pour into the courtroom, obscuring our vision. Gas masks, Elias yelled, pulling a respirator from his bag. The veterans moved with practiced speed, but I was caught in the open. The smoke was acrid and burned my lungs instantly. I dropped to my knees, searching for the floor. Through the haze, I saw my father's silhouette, moving toward the judge's bench. He wasn't trying to escape. He was reaching for the service pistol she had momentarily lowered. My mother screamed, a high and piercing sound that cut through the chaos and the choking white clouds. I lunged through the smoke, guided by the sound of scuffling feet. My hand closed around a cold metal barrel. We struggled in the gray light, our breaths coming in ragged, desperate gasps. I could feel the strength of his desperation. He was fighting for his life, while I was fighting for justice. The gun discharged once, the sound muffled by the thick atmosphere. The bullet shattered a nearby marble column, sending shards of stone flying like shrapnel. I didn't let go. I drove my shoulder into his chest. We hit the floor together, the impact knocking the air from my lungs. The smoke began to clear as the ventilation system kicked into high gear. I looked down and saw that I was holding the weapon. My father lay beneath me, his face a mask of pure terror. He looked at the muzzle, and then at my eyes. For the first time, he saw the soldier he had tried to kill. The doors finally burst open, but it wasn't the police. A man in a suit stood there. The red text on the black screen burned into my retinas. External override initiated. The monitor pulsed. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The oversight agent pulled a small, silver remote from his sleeve. He hadn't just been watching me. He had been waiting for me to connect to the network. My father started to laugh, a dry and jagged sound. The upload was stalled at the final gate. The truth was suspended in a digital void. I gripped the edge of the table until the wood bit into my palms. "You can't stop the physical copies," I said. My voice was a rasping blade. The agent shook his head slowly. He pointed toward the heavy evidence locker I had just emptied. A small, orange light was blinking inside the metal frame. It was a localized thermite charge. The medals and the field gloves were already melting into a puddle of slag. Everything I had reclaimed was turning into gray ash. Judge Morales didn't hesitate. She stepped down from the bench and jammed the muzzle of her weapon into the agent's ribs. "Disarm the charge," she commanded. Her eyes were hard as granite. The room felt smaller as the veterans closed the circle. Elias reached for the silver remote, his movements blurring with predatory speed. The agent's smirk vanished. He realized the law of the courtroom had been replaced by the law of the unit. The air smelled of burning plastic and old ozone. The agent's finger twitched over the remote, but he didn't press it. He saw the cold promise in the eyes of the men around him. "The server is offshore," he whispered. "You'll never reach the source." I looked at the black screen and then at my father. He was watching the fire in the locker with a look of pure, religious ecstasy. He thought the destruction of the physical proof made him a ghost again. But he forgot about the coin in my pocket. I pulled the chipped metal coin from my jacket and held it high. It was the one Morales had pressed into my palm in the desert. The red strobe light caught the jagged edges. "You didn't erase the memory," I said. My father's eyes widened as I flipped the coin toward the oversight agent. He caught it by reflex. On the back, a tiny, microscopic QR code was etched into the copper. It was the actual link to the satellite backup. My father's face turned gray. The agent scanned the code with his phone, his hand trembling. The digital wall collapsed instantly. A notification pinged on every phone in the courtroom. The upload was complete. The headlines were already hitting the wires. My father slumped over, his head hitting the table with a dull thud. The battle was over. But the room remained silent. I looked at my hands and saw they were finally still. I turned toward the doors, but the locks remained firmly in place. Even with the truth out, we were still trapped in a room wired to explode, waiting for the smoke to clear or the walls to fall.